I've got some troubling news about England's royal family. Prince William had spent decades learning how to carry grief without letting the world see its weight. But inside a restricted room at Windsor, one hidden palace document finally shattered that control. The file contained Diana's own desperate warning about her eldest son, a plea written only weeks before her death. When William reached the final paragraph, he stopped reading, lowered the pages, and whispered the question no one in the room was prepared to answer. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had been summoned to Windsor after archivists uncovered a restricted file marked the Kensington Memorandum, Personal Protection of Prince William. A memorandum is a formal record that preserves important concerns or instructions. This one had been sealed since 1997 inside the Royal Archives, the secure collection that holds private papers and official records. No earlier review of Diana's correspondence had ever included it. Catherine traveled with him, but stayed outside while he read alone. Diana had dictated the document after confronting senior palace officials. Her warning was direct. Her son was being pushed into an unbearable choice between his parents, and no one had the right to use William's love for her as a weapon after the divorce. William kept reading until the words became personal. Diana described his sleepless nights, his fear of disappointing Charles, and the way he hid his distress behind perfect obedience. The prince felt the past close around him. His mother had seen everything, even when he believed nobody understood. The chair scraped against the floor. Catherine entered and found her husband standing beside the table, one hand pressed against the pages. William told her Diana knew he was suffering. Then his voice hardened. Powerful people had known too, and they had buried her warning. The final page deepened the wound. Diana feared a confidential palace strategy was being prepared to portray her as emotionally unstable if she refused to cooperate. Yet several names were missing. An attached page had been removed, leaving a broken reference and an unexplained gap. Elsewhere, Charles privately received confirmation. He set down his pen without speaking. His private secretary watched his face and understood the most disturbing truth. The king was not shocked that the memorandum existed. He was shocked that William now possessed it. William refused to return the file. He wanted the missing page, the names, and the reason Diana's plea had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. The document had not merely reopened his grief. It forced everyone touched by her final struggle to face what they had protected, concealed, and allowed a young prince to endure. The memorandum carried Diana's name, but its deepest wound belonged to the family she left behind. William saw the voice of a mother trying to protect him. Charles saw the return of a conflict he had spent years trying to contain. Catherine saw something more dangerous, a husband being pulled back into the pain of a childhood he had survived by never fully speaking about it. William had loved Diana with the fierce loyalty of a son who understood too much, too early. Even as a child, he sensed her loneliness and tried to comfort her when the pressure around the family became unbearable. That bond gave him warmth, but it also placed a quiet responsibility on his shoulders. He was not only her son. At times, he felt like her protector. Charles had always viewed the collapse of the marriage through a different wound. The king believed private pain became impossible to control once it turned into public conflict. Yet the newly discovered memorandum challenged that belief. Diana had not been attacking the monarchy in those pages. She had been trying to settle one private issue, the emotional protection of William. William felt the betrayal growing stronger. He told Catherine that the adults around him must have noticed the fear, the sleeplessness, and the pressure to remain loyal to both parents. Still, they treated his silence as proof that he was coping. The future king remembered being encouraged to say less whenever the tension became too intense. Duty had become another word for hiding pain. Catherine sat beside him in a private Windsor study with no aides present. William folded and unfolded his mother's final page until the paper began to crease. The princess gently asked him to stop before it tore. He looked down at Diana's words and admitted they did not feel like a message from the past. They felt like a warning written directly to the man he had become. Charles read a copied paragraph elsewhere. Diana had written that William was learning to hide pain before he had even learned what to do with it. The monarch closed the folder and asked his private secretary to leave. He did not challenge the words. He recognized them, and that recognition carried more guilt than denial ever could. The memorandum then exposed something darker. Diana referred to an unnamed senior figure who warned that William's access to her might be reduced if she challenged future palace briefings. A palace briefing is an official or private exchange used to shape information and decisions. Her plea was no longer only emotional. It was evidence of pressure, and learned of the discovery through a documented archive report and immediately asked whether the original seal had been broken. The Princess Royal knew that a damaged seal could prove someone had entered the file before William ever saw it. Her question suggested that another person had feared this moment for years. William requested a private meeting with Charles. His condition was absolute. No courtiers, no lawyers, and no prepared royal language. But before father and son could face each other, the prince needed to uncover the single confrontation that had driven Diana to write the memorandum. And the moment the palace finally crossed the line. The hidden file did not begin with a lawyer, an archivist, or a palace command. It began after a charity reception in June 1997, when Diana entered a private room expecting a routine discussion and discovered that her relationship with William had become part of a royal pressure campaign. One conversation changed everything. By sunrise, she had dictated the memorandum that would remain hidden until her son was old enough to understand exactly what had been done. Diana was already living under relentless attention after the divorce. Her charity work kept her close to the public, and every appearance carried enormous weight because her popularity often overshadowed the formal royal household. That imbalance made palace officials nervous. They feared that one unscripted comment from her could reopen the family conflict and weaken the control they were desperate to preserve. William stood at the center of that fear. He was approaching adolescence, attending school, and becoming painfully aware of the hostility surrounding his parents. The future king was expected to remain calm because his position mattered to the monarchy. Yet that expectation ignored one simple truth. He was still a child being asked to survive an adult war. Diana entered the private meeting after a London children's charity reception, expecting a routine warning about protocol. A senior royal secretary, a high-ranking official who managed sensitive palace decisions, spoke in careful language at first. Then he crossed the line. He told her that if she gave another unsanctioned interview or publicly challenged the household, William's private visits with her might need to be reconsidered for his stability. Diana pushed her chair back. She did not shout. Her anger became colder than that. The princess demanded that her son never be used as leverage again, and she warned the official that William already believed he had to protect everyone around him. The secretary tried to soften the threat, but she had heard enough. Later that night, Diana called a trusted advisor through a recorded private conversation preserved in his notes. She admitted that William was being trained to accept emotional silence as part of kingship. Her fury slowly gave way to guilt. She knew the public conflict had hurt him too, and she feared he would one day blame himself for failing to save either parent. By morning, Diana dictated the Kensington Memorandum. She named the official, described the threat in precise detail, and demanded that the warning enter the permanent royal record. The document was copied and sealed. 3 days later, however, a handwritten archive log showed that it had been moved into a restricted cabinet under an authorization code linked to the sovereign's private office. William studied that same log decades later and pressed his finger against the faded mark. He asked, and whether his grandmother could have approved the transfer. The Princess Royal hesitated, and her silence carried its own answer. Then William noticed a second notation. Charles had been informed of an incident involving access to the princes. The past had now delivered the prince to his father's private door, carrying a document that demanded more than an explanation. It demanded an admission. There were no advisors to soften the language, no private secretaries to redirect the conversation, and no official statement waiting outside the door. William entered carrying Diana's memorandum. Charles remained seated behind a small table. Between them rested almost 30 years of silence. Then William placed the document in front of his father and asked one direct question. Did you know they threatened to use me against her? Charles looked at the original pages but did not touch them. The king had already read copied extracts. Yet William wanted him confronted by Diana's own annotations, the handwritten marks showing where anger had broken through a restraint. The meeting took place in a secluded Windsor sitting room, far from the formal spaces where every royal word could be managed. William stood before him not as heir to the throne, but as Diana's son. Their relationship had survived scandal, family departures, succession, and years of controlled reconciliation. That history made the moment more painful. They had rebuilt trust without ever opening the wound now lying between them. Charles admitted that he knew there had been a dispute over Diana's access to the children. He insisted he never authorized anyone to threaten her. William answered without raising his voice. Failing to stop the pressure, he said, was still a choice. The king argued that the household had been trying to protect William and Harry from endless conflict. The prince's restraint finally broke. Why, he demanded, did protection always require silence from Diana and obedience from her sons? Why had every adult decision left the children carrying consequences they never created? Charles reached toward the memorandum. William kept one hand firmly over it. Neither man moved. The silence became unbearable. Finally, the monarch withdrew his hand, and his son told him those words would not vanish into another locked cabinet. Charles then revealed what the copied record had not shown. Queen Elizabeth had ordered the file sealed because she feared its language could destroy the last remaining trust between Diana, the palace, and the future king. The late monarch intended the memorandum to remain private until William was older. William stared at his father. He was older now. He had been an adult for decades. Why had nobody returned the truth to him? Charles answered that reopening the file would have caused damage without changing the past. To William, the words sounded painfully familiar. Once again, someone else had decided what he was strong enough to know. The prince moved toward the door, then stopped. He announced that the archive authorization and missing attachment would be investigated independently, even if the inquiry reached the king's closest advisors. William had finally confronted his father, but the deeper question remained untouched. Who still controlled Diana's record, and who would lose power if the missing page returned? Within hours, the palace stopped treating the memorandum as a family wound and began treating it as a threat to the crown. Lawyers examined ownership. Archivists reviewed access logs. Advisors debated whether Diana's words could ever become public. Yet behind those formal discussions stood one grieving son who had already made his decision. No office, title, or constitutional warning would force him to surrender the truth again. William entered the briefing knowing the system would speak in careful terms. Control of the file was divided between the royal archives, the sovereign's private office, and the heir's household. Each office claimed a duty to protect sensitive material, but to the prince that language sounded dangerously close to the silence that had hidden Diana's warning. Charles's advisors argued that any release could reopen old accusations and damage the reign. They warned that private family pain might become a constitutional crisis, a conflict serious enough to shake confidence in the monarchy itself. The king listened, but William refused to let the discussion become only about institutional survival. The prince told the room that the real damage had already happened. A frightened mother had warned that her child was being used, and powerful people had decided the child should never know. His voice remained controlled, yet every sentence carried anger. Catherine watched her husband struggle between duty and grief. After the meeting, she found him alone in a corridor, still holding the copied pages. The princess reminded him that exposing the truth could not come at the cost of destroying himself. William admitted that he did not know how to separate justice for Diana from the pain of becoming her son again, and confronted Charles privately soon after. She placed the archive log before him and said protecting the crown could not mean forcing William to inherit the same silence that wounded his mother. The king turned away and admitted he no longer knew which decision caused less pain. The princess answered that avoiding pain had already caused enough. Then the investigation shifted. A retired records officer confirmed through a documented interview that the missing attachment had been removed in 2002, just before William gained wider access to family archives. The officer remembered being told the page contained names too damaging for the prince. The removal order carried the initials of a former senior courtier, a powerful royal official who had served both Queen Elizabeth and Charles. He was still alive. He was still close to the household. William ordered him to appear for a private interview. The palace had tried to turn the document into a legal problem, but one elderly courtier was about to transform it into a confession. The former courtier entered Windsor carrying no briefcase and offering no prepared defense. He appeared exhausted before the questioning even began. William expected excuses, damaged memories, or another carefully protected version of the past. Instead, the man reached inside his coat, removed a sealed envelope, and placed it on the table. The missing page had not been destroyed. He had kept it for 24 years because he feared the day Diana's son would finally ask for the truth. William sat with Catherine and while Charles stayed away. The king had been informed of the interview, but he knew his presence might silence the man before the truth emerged. The retired courtier explained that he removed the attachment in 2002, just before William gained wider access to private family records. He had been ordered to eliminate anything that could permanently turn the prince against the monarchy. William asked why he obeyed. The courtier answered that he believed protecting the institution justified withholding painful information from a young future king. The prince stared at him and said that was exactly what Diana had feared. Adults had decided silence was protection, then forced a child to live with the damage, and recognized the signatures before anyone spoke. She removed her glasses, studied the page, and looked directly at the former official. The princess told him that loyalty without conscience became cowardice. He lowered his head, but she did not soften the judgment. Catherine opened the envelope and handed the missing page to William. His hands tightened as he read Diana's final request. If anything happened to her, her sons must one day be told that she had fought for their freedom to love both parents without punishment. The words struck him harder than any accusation. His mother had not been demanding victory. She had been asking that her children be spared. The restored page confirmed that Queen Elizabeth knew the threat had been made. The late monarch ordered the responsible secretary removed from direct contact with Diana, but she also commanded that the details remain sealed to prevent another public family collapse. Her decision stopped the immediate pressure while preserving the silence around it. Charles had been told the matter was resolved. He never asked to read Diana's full statement. That did not make him the architect of the threat, but it left him responsible for accepting reassurance without demanding truth. William acted immediately. He suspended the archive officials linked to the concealment and ordered that the memorandum enter the historical record, the permanent official account of royal events. No private authorization would hide it again. That evening, Charles requested another meeting. This time the king did not summon his heir. He asked for his son. The missing page had restored Diana's voice, but only one final conversation could decide whether that voice would divide them forever or force them toward honesty. The second meeting carried none of the anger of the first. Charles stood without a desk between them. William arrived without the memorandum. For once, neither man brought the machinery of monarchy into the room. There was only a father who had failed to ask enough questions, and a son who had spent most of his life wondering whether his mother's pain had mattered to the people who survived her. Charles had chosen his private rooms because no aides, lawyers, Catherine, and would be present. The silence mattered. Without witnesses, the king could speak as a father instead of a sovereign. William could answer as a son instead of the future monarch expected to protect the institution. Charles admitted that the palace culture of the 1990s had rewarded containment over compassion. Problems were managed, statements were controlled, and painful emotions were treated as dangers to be contained. The monarch said he had relied on advisors because facing Diana directly had become emotionally exhausting and politically dangerous. William listened, but he did not let those words become an excuse. He told his father that he did not need him to accept every accusation in the memorandum. He needed Charles to admit that Diana's fear had been real, and that their son had paid the price for everyone's silence. The wound was not only what happened, it was that adults saw the damage and still chose not to speak. Charles struggled before answering. Then the king said Diana had loved William with absolute intensity. He admitted he should have recognized how desperately she was trying to protect the boy even after their marriage had collapsed. The words came slowly, but they carried no palace polish. Charles removed his signet ring and placed it on the table. A signet ring is a traditional symbol of personal and royal authority, and setting it aside stripped the moment of rank. He looked at William and said, "I was afraid that asking more would make everything worse. I understand now that not asking was also a choice." William finally revealed the guilt beneath his anger. He admitted he had always feared his childhood silence made Diana feel abandoned. Charles answered immediately, "No child should ever carry responsibility for the failure of adults." The prince lowered his head. For the first time, he allowed grief to exist without turning it into duty or accusation. He did not forgive every decision, but he accepted his father's admission as honest. Charles and William agreed that the memorandum would be preserved in full, with an official historical note explaining that Diana had raised concerns about her children's emotional welfare. William left without the answers he had once imagined, but with something harder and more valuable: truth. By sunrise, the existence of the Kensington Memorandum had escaped the palace walls. Headlines did not focus on constitutional procedure or archive policy. They focused on one devastating image: a mother warning that her son was being crushed between love and duty. Across Britain, Diana's words reopened old grief. But William's response transformed that grief into a demand for honesty rather than revenge. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the sealed memorandum had been recovered and formally added to the historical royal record. The statement protected William's private childhood details, but it acknowledged that Diana had raised serious concerns about his emotional welfare. Broadcasters immediately framed the discovery as a test of Charles's reign and William's future kingship. Commentators asked whether the palace had finally broken with its old instinct to protect itself through secrecy. The question mattered because the monarchy was no longer being judged only by what happened in 1997. It was being judged by how honestly it responded now. William feared Diana's pain would become another spectacle. He told Catherine that every headline risked turning a mother's warning into public entertainment. The princess urged him to make one controlled appearance. If he remained silent, hostile voices would define the meaning of the document for him. Charles faced renewed criticism, but the king rejected his advisors' proposal to challenge the memorandum's interpretation. He told them that defending himself at that moment would appear to silence Diana again. The monarch understood that one careless statement could undo the fragile honesty reached with his son. Outside Kensington Palace, hundreds gathered beneath the gates carrying white roses and handwritten cards. One newspaper front page rose above the crowd with 5 words in black letters: "She tried to protect her boy." William stepped forward in a short recorded address. The prince confirmed he had read the full document and said its central concern was not revenge, scandal, or power. It was a mother's fear for her children. His voice tightened, but he refused to condemn his father publicly. The future king said the monarchy must be strong enough to preserve painful truths rather than bury them. His words marked a different kind of leadership, one built not on pretending the past was harmless, but on refusing to repeat it. Charles watched privately and lowered his head when William described silence as a wound passed from one generation to another, and sat nearby and told him his son had just protected both Diana's memory and the crown. The document had begun as evidence of fear, secrecy, and a mother's desperation. It ended as something the palace had never intended it to become: a guide for the future. William could not return to 1997. He could not remove Diana's loneliness, challenge the officials who had frightened her, or tell his younger self that none of it was his fault. But he could decide that the silence she feared would end with him. William called a final family meeting with Charles, Catherine, and senior household representatives. He made one thing clear from the beginning: this was not about punishing a new generation for the failures of the old one. It was about making sure no royal child would ever again be trapped inside a conflict created by adults. The complete Kensington Memorandum was permanently catalogued. Every page, signature, and attachment would remain part of the official historical record, protected from private removal or secret authorization. Access would stay controlled to protect childhood details, but the document's existence and meaning could never again be denied. William then announced a new royal family welfare protocol, a formal set of rules designed to protect children inside the monarchy. No young royal could be used in disputes between households, advisors, or family members. Any concern involving a child would have to be documented independently and reviewed outside the immediate conflict. Charles approved the reform without amendment. The king understood that the change would always be linked to Diana, and he accepted that link. In a private recorded conversation after the meeting, he admitted her warning had exposed a weakness the institution should have faced long ago. Catherine watched William carefully as the decision became official. The princess knew this was more than policy for him. It was the first time he had turned childhood pain into something that could protect others, and offered her support without hesitation. She told the prince that preserving truth while protecting dignity was not weakness. It was leadership. William returned alone to the archive room after the others had gone. He placed the restored page beside the memorandum, closed the file, and rested his hand on the cover. Then he said the words he had carried since the moment he first began reading. "You were heard. It took too long, but you were heard." The discovery did not prove that everyone around Diana intended to harm her. It revealed something more painful. Fear, pride, exhaustion, and blind loyalty had allowed a mother's warning to be buried. William refused to release intimate childhood details. He would not turn Diana's pain into entertainment. By preserving the truth without exposing the private suffering behind it, the future king rejected both total secrecy and reckless disclosure. Charles and William did not leave the crisis untouched. They left wounded, but honest. Their relationship survived because neither man could hide behind a false version of the past any longer. Diana's hidden document became the line between the old crown and the monarchy William intended to lead. The institution endured because he proved that truth could be faced without surrendering duty, family, or compassion. Prince William entered the archive as a heartbroken son searching for answers. He left having given Diana the one thing the hidden document had denied her for nearly 30 years: recognition, protection, and the certainty that her voice would never be buried again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.